It was a rainy evening in October when I decided to stop by Starbucks for a hot coffee. The drizzle had turned into a downpour, and I needed some warmth before heading home. As I pushed open the heavy glass door, the familiar aroma of coffee beans and baked goods enveloped me, providing an immediate sense of comfort. The cafe was unusually empty, save for a few scattered patrons and the baristas behind the counter. I walked up and ordered a large Americano, my usual. The barista, a young woman with a friendly smile, took my order and gestured towards the pickup area. As I waited, I found a seat near the window, watching the rain create rhythmic patterns on the glass. A few minutes passed, and my name was called. I grabbed my coffee and settled into my seat, relishing the first sip of the hot, bitter liquid. That's when I noticed him, a man seated in the far corner of the cafe. He was staring intently at something on his laptop, oblivious to his surroundings. There was something unsettling about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and focused on my coffee. But out of the corner of my eye, I could still see the man now occasionally glancing around the cafe, his eyes darting with a nervous energy. The rain outside intensified, and a clap of thunder made me jump. That's when the lights flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The other customers seemed unfazed, but the man in the corner looked visibly shaken. He quickly shut his laptop and began gathering his things in a hurried, almost frantic manner. I watched as he stood up, his movements jerky and erratic. Then, without warning, he walked briskly towards me. My heart raced as he approached, his eyes locked onto mine. As he passed by, he whispered something under his breath, a phrase I couldn't quite make out, but it sounded like a warning. Confused and a little scared, I decided it was time to leave. I got up, throwing one last glance at the now empty corner where the man had been sitting. As I reached the door, I noticed something odd. A small, old-looking book lying on the floor where the man had been. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. It seemed like a journal, filled with handwritten notes and strange symbols. Flipping through the pages, a sense of unease grew within me. The writings were erratic, filled with tales of paranoia, conspiracy theories, and dark rituals. Suddenly, the cafe door burst open, and a gust of cold wind blew in, scattering the pages of the journal. I looked up to see a group of people entering, shaking off the rain. Among them, to my utter disbelief, was the man from the corner. His eyes met mine, filled with a mix of fear and desperation. I quickly shut the journal and stuffed it into my bag, my mind racing. The man approached me again, this time with a sense of urgency. "You shouldn't have touched that," he whispered hoarsely. "It's dangerous." Before I could respond, he hurried out of the cafe, disappearing into the rainy night. I was left standing there, bewildered and frightened, clutching my coffee cup. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts were consumed by the encounter and the mysterious journal. Once home, I locked the door behind me and sat down to examine the book more closely. The writings spoke of a secret society, ancient rituals, and a coming event that would change the world. It was the ramblings of a disturbed mind, yet something about it felt unnervingly real. The man's warning echoed in my head, and I wondered if I had unwittingly stumbled upon something sinister. Sleep eluded me that night. Every sound seemed amplified, and shadows in my room took on menacing shapes. I kept thinking about the man and the journal, wondering if I should go to the police. But what would I tell them? That a stranger in a Starbucks handed me a book of madness? The next morning, I decided to return the journal to the cafe, hoping the man would come back for it. But when I arrived, the atmosphere was different. The employees were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. I overheard snippets of their conversation, something about a tragic incident involving one of the regulars. A sense of dread washed over me. I approached the counter and asked about the man from the previous night. The barista's face turned pale. She told me that he had been found dead that morning, not far from the cafe. The cause of death was unknown, but the police were involved. I left the cafe in a daze, the journal still in my bag. The reality of the situation was overwhelming. Was his death connected to the journal? To the secret society he wrote about? Or was it all just the delusions of a troubled mind? Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The journal remained hidden in my room, a constant reminder of that eerie night. I couldn't bring myself to read it again, yet I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it either. To this day, I still wonder about the man and the true nature of his journal. Was it a gateway to something dark and unknown, or merely the writings of a lost soul? The mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps it's for the best. Some truths are too terrifying to uncover. As a young man in his early 20s, I always thought of Starbucks as a peaceful escape from the daily grind, a haven where I could enjoy my favorite coffee and lose myself in a book or my thoughts. But one evening, my perception changed entirely, transforming an ordinary coffee shop into the backdrop for an experience that still haunts me to this day. It was a typical chilly evening in October when I decided to visit my local Starbucks. The place was busier than usual, filled with the sound of frothing milk and the murmur of conversations. I ordered my usual, a tall cappuccino, and found a cozy corner to settle down. The warm, dim lighting and the soft hum of activity around me formed the perfect ambiance for reading. Around an hour into my stay, the crowd started to thin out. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting across the room, staring intently at me. He was middle-aged, with unkempt hair and a ragged beard, wearing a tattered coat that seemed too thin for the weather. There was something unsettling about his gaze, something predatory. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, attributing his stare to mere coincidence, or perhaps my imagination. As the minutes ticked by, his gaze never wavered. Every time I looked up from my book, there he was, watching me. I started to feel uneasy, a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I decided to leave, thinking a change of scenery would ease my mind. I packed up my things and walked to the door, trying to act nonchalant. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a wall, but it was refreshing compared to the stifling tension inside. I started walking home, quickening my pace, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. A few blocks down, I heard footsteps behind me. They were steady and seemed to be keeping pace with my own. A surge of fear shot through me. I didn't want to look back, afraid of confirming my suspicion. But curiosity and fear got the better of me, and I glanced over my shoulder. It was him, the man from Starbucks. He was following me. Panic set in. My heart raced, and my mind screamed at me to run. But I didn't want to show fear, so I kept my pace steady, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. I decided to test my theory. I took a sudden turn down a side street, one that was out of the way of my usual route. The footsteps behind me turned as well. There was no denying it now. He was following me. Fear turned to terror. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Run? Scream for help? I was in a residential area, but the streets were eerily deserted. The few streetlights cast long, ominous shadows, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I quickened my pace, and so did he. I could hear his breathing now, ragged and heavy. My mind raced with horrific possibilities of what his intentions could be. I reached for my phone, planning to call the police, but in my panic, I dropped it. As I bent to pick it up, I saw his feet stop just a few yards behind me. I grabbed my phone and stood up, turning to face him. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely hiding my fear. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those unnerving, blinking eyes. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat. I braced myself for the worst. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to me. Confused and still terrified, I took it. It was a drawing, childlike in execution. It depicted two figures, one larger and one smaller, holding hands under a sun. The larger figure was labeled Dad, and the smaller one, me. I looked up at him, questions racing through my mind. His eyes, which had seemed so menacing before, now brimmed with sadness. He pointed to the drawing, then to himself, and finally in the direction of the Starbucks we had left. It dawned on me then. He wasn't following me with ill intent. He was lost, maybe even homeless, and for some reason, he had latched onto me. Maybe I reminded him of someone, his son perhaps. The fear that had gripped me gave way to a profound sadness. Here was a man, lost in more ways than one, reaching out for some kind of connection in a world that had probably forgotten him. I asked him if he needed help, but he just shook his head, took back the drawing, and walked away. I stood there for a long time, watching him disappear into the night, the image of the drawing etched into my memory. That night changed my perspective on life and the judgments we make about people. It taught me that sometimes the things we fear aren't what they seem, and that behind every pair of eyes is a story we might never fully understand. The Starbucks, once a refuge, had become a reminder of that encounter. A true horror story, not of ghosts or monsters, but of the human condition, loneliness, and the unexpected ways our paths can intersect with others. It was a chilly October evening, the kind that sends shivers down your spine even before the sun sets. I remember wrapping my coat tighter as I hurried through the bustling streets. My destination was a familiar one, a Starbucks located in a quaint old part of the city. I needed my usual caffeine fix, a grande Americano, no sugar. Little did I know, that evening my coffee wouldn't be the only thing to keep me awake. The Starbucks, an elegant structure with Victorian-era architecture, stood at the corner of Elm and Maple Streets. It always had an eerie charm, especially after dark, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavier, as if laden with unspoken tales. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, I pushed the door open. The warm, welcoming aroma of coffee beans greeted me, a stark contrast to the nippy air outside. The cafe was unusually empty for this hour, with only a few patrons scattered around. I made my way to the counter, where a barista, a young woman with a tired smile, took my order. As I waited for my coffee, I couldn't help but notice the quietness of the place. The usual hum of conversations and clinking of cups was absent. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling and thanked the barista as she handed me my drink. I chose a secluded table near the window, one that offered a view of the dimly lit street outside. The warmth of the cup was comforting in my hands. That's when I first noticed him, an old man seated in the farthest corner of the cafe. He was staring intently at me, his eyes dark and unsettling. There was something off about him, something in his gaze that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to focus on my coffee, to ignore the man's unsettling stare, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked up again, only to find his seat empty. I scanned the cafe, but he was nowhere to be seen. A sense of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A sudden, cold gust of wind made me shiver, and I realized the door hadn't opened. How could there be a draft? As I pondered over this, a whisper echoed through the cafe. It was faint, almost inaudible, like someone was murmuring a secret. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, but everyone seemed oblivious to the sound. The whisper grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, almost pleading. That's when things took a turn for the worse. The lights flickered violently, casting ominous shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could see my breath in the air. Panic set in, but I was rooted to my seat, unable to move. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights stabilized, the temperature returned to normal, and the whispering ceased. I looked around, bewildered. The other customers and the barista carried on as if nothing had happened. Was I imagining things? I got up, intending to leave, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see the old man, but it was just the barista, looking concerned. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I hurried out of the Starbucks, not looking back. Once outside, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw it, the old Starbucks sign hanging above the door. It was faded and peeling, revealing another sign beneath, an older, more archaic one. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This Starbucks was built over an ancient establishment, one that perhaps had its own share of dark tales. I walked home, my mind racing with questions. Who was the old man? What were those voices? Was I experiencing a haunting, a glimpse into the cafe's eerie past? I couldn't find the answers, but one thing was certain. I was never going back to that Starbucks again. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I did some research. It turned out that the Starbucks was indeed built on the site of an old, long-forgotten cafe, one that had burned down many years ago, taking several lives with it. The old man I saw? He matched the description of the cafe's owner who perished in the fire. Since that night, I've steered clear of that Starbucks. Sometimes when I pass by, I can't help but glance at the window where I sat, half expecting to see the old man staring back at me. The experience has left me with more questions than answers, a haunting reminder that some places hold secrets far darker than we can imagine. It was a cold, rainy evening in October when I decided to stop by my local Starbucks for a coffee. The weather had been dreary all day, and I needed something warm to shake off the chill. I'd been frequenting this Starbucks for years. It was a cozy, familiar place where the baristas knew my order by heart. A grande dark roast, no sugar, no cream. As I pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bell greeted me, and I was enveloped by the rich aroma of coffee beans. The cafe was unusually empty for this time of the evening, save for a few scattered customers. I made my way to the counter, placed my order, and while waiting, I took a seat by the window, watching the rain cascade down the glass. The barista called out my name, and I picked up my coffee, savoring the warmth of the cup in my hands. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting in the far corner of the cafe. He was facing away from me, staring intently at his laptop screen. Something about him seemed off, but I couldn't quite place it. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I focused on my coffee, but my eyes kept drifting back to the man. He hadn't moved an inch. He was eerily still, almost like a statue. I reasoned with myself that he was probably just engrossed in his work, but the atmosphere in the cafe had shifted. The air felt heavier, and the usual hum of conversation had dwindled to a hush. Curiosity getting the better of me, I decided to get a closer look. I picked up my cup and walked over to the condiment station near where he was sitting. That's when I realized something truly bizarre. There was no reflection of him on the window beside his table. It was as though he didn't exist. Yet there he was, right in front of me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly returned to my seat, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just the angle, or perhaps the lighting. I couldn't focus on anything else, though. The man hadn't moved a muscle, and the lack of his reflection was unnerving. Just then, a barista approached the man, asking if he would like a refill. The man slowly turned his head, and what I saw made my heart stop. His eyes were completely black, void of any white. It was as if his eyes were two dark abysses. The barista, seemingly unfazed, smiled and went back to the counter. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was I imagining things? Was this some sort of trick? I mustered the courage to approach the man. As I got closer, I felt a coldness emanating from him. Swallowing my fear, I asked, "Excuse me, are you okay?" He slowly turned his head towards me, and in a voice that sounded distant yet clear, he said, "Do you see them too?" "See what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The shadows," he replied, his eyes still locked on mine. "They're always watching." I felt a shiver run through me. There was a seriousness in his tone that was unsettling. I took a step back, unsure of how to respond. Just then, the barista called out, "Sir, your coffee is ready." I glanced back at the counter, grateful for the interruption. When I turned back, the man was gone. His laptop, his belongings, everything. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I approached the barista, asking about the man. She looked at me, puzzled. "What man?" she asked. "You've been the only one sitting in that corner since you came in." I was dumbfounded. I knew what I had seen, but it was clear I was the only one. I left the Starbucks, my mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What did he mean by the shadows? For weeks after that encounter, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence, and every reflection seemed to hide a secret. The Starbucks, once a place of comfort, now felt like a gateway to something unknown, something unseen. I never saw the man again, and no one else seemed to have noticed him. But his words lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of that eerie evening. The shadows are always watching, and sometimes, in the most ordinary places, we catch a glimpse of the extraordinary, the unexplainable, the unseen.